The autumn of 1834 brought an early chill to Albemarle County, Virginia. The leaves turned and fell with a particular swiftness that year, blanketing the rolling hills in shades of rust and gold. On the outskirts of the county, set back from the main road by a long, uninviting lane of packed earth and flanked by dense woods, stood the Sullivan estate. It was not a grand plantation, but a stern, two-story stone house, flanked by a modest barn and surrounded by a high fieldstone wall that seemed intended less for demarcation than for seclusion. The family who lived there, the Sullivans, were known more by their absence than their presence. Mr. Elias Sullivan was a man of some means, though the source of his wealth was a subject of quiet speculation. He was seen in town perhaps 4 times a year to settle accounts. A tall, severe figure who offered no pleasantries and discouraged inquiry. His wife was a phantom. Some claimed to have seen her in a carriage years before, a pale face behind glass, but none could recall her name. And then there were the children. It was understood that there were children. The orders placed with the local merchant, Silas Croft, were too large for a man and wife alone. Immense quantities of flour, salted meats, milk, and, most consistently, bolts of plain linen and heavy casks of lye. But no child from the Sullivan estate was ever seen in town at church or playing in the fields visible from the road. The house stood silent, its windows like vacant eyes, a place of rumors and uneasy conjecture. The first documented sign of abnormality comes from a letter penned by Mrs. Eleanor Vance, whose small farm was situated a mile downwind from the Sullivan property. In a letter to her sister in Richmond, dated October the 9th, 1834, she writes of the changing season. Her concerns are domestic, her prose unremarkable until a short passage near the end. It reads, "The quiet from the Sullivan place has deepened. For 3 days no smoke has risen from their chimneys, though the mornings are now sharp with frost. I remarked on it to John, who said Mr. Sullivan likely took his family on a trip, but their carriage is still in the barn. I saw it myself from the ridge last evening. It is strange. A house that large and full of life ought to make some noise. Theirs makes none at all." A week later, the merchant Silas Croft made an entry in his business ledger. The Sullivan account, which had been maintained with flawless punctuality for 6 years, was marked for a quarterly delivery on October the 15th. The entry for that day is brief and clinical. Delivery for E. Sullivan. Boy returned. Gates barred from within. No answer at the call box. Such an event was not unheard of, and a second entry was made for the 17th. Second attempt for Sullivan delivery. Gates remained barred. No answer. For a man of Mr. Sullivan's rigid habits, this was a significant deviation. His orders were as predictable as the calendar, and his payments were always made in advance. A note in the ledger's margin, added on October 20th, reveals Croft's growing impatience. Account past due, $7, no word. Back on her farm, Eleanor Vance's correspondence with her sister reflects a mounting unease. A letter dated October 21st describes a recent storm. "A terrible gale passed through 2 nights ago. It took several shingles from our roof and felled an old oak near the creek. The wind howled so fiercely it sounded almost like a human cry. Since that night, a shutter on the west side of the Sullivan house has been banging against the stone. It is a dreadful, rhythmic sound that carries all the way to our property when the wind is right. Bang, 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 all day and all night. Surely someone is home. Who could bear such a noise and not fix it? It speaks of a deep neglect, or a deeper trouble." The most troubling early account comes from the private diary of Jedediah Mills, a farmer whose lands bordered the Sullivan estate to the north. Mills was a practical, God-fearing man, not given to fancy. His entry for October 25th is stark. The Sullivan's corn is rotting in the field. The stalks are brown and heavy, the ears unpicked. I saw 2 of their cattle by the fence line today. Their ribs are showing. Their calls are weak. It is a sin to let good crops and good animals go to waste in such a manner. I am of a mind to cross the wall and see to the animals myself. But the place has a grim reputation. The gates are chained, and the walls are high. It feels like a fortress, and I do not know what it is meant to keep out, or what it is meant to keep in. By the end of October, the banging shutter on the Sullivan house had fallen silent, likely torn from its hinges by the wind. The silence that returned was, as Eleanor Vance described it, heavier than before. The separate streams of concern throughout the county were beginning to merge into a single, troubling narrative. Silas Croft had sent his boy a third and final time, only to have him return pale and frightened, claiming he heard a faint scratching sound from behind the main gate. Jedediah Mills noted in his diary that a foul odor had begun to drift from the Sullivan lands, an odor he could not place. He wrote, "It is not the smell of rot, not of the corn, or of dead livestock. It is a damp cellar smell, of earth turned over and left in the dark. Underneath it is something else, something sharp and sour that catches in the back of the throat." The community's unspoken fears finally coalesced into action on the 1st of November. Silas Croft, his unpaid account now a secondary concern to the unnerving mystery, and Jedediah Mills, tormented by the thought of the suffering animals, rode together into town. There, they presented their concerns to the county magistrate, a man named Philip Davies. The official minutes from the magistrate's office are preserved, and a brief entry for that day confirms their petition. Petition received from S. Croft and J. Mills regarding the abandonment of the Sullivan estate. Concerns of animal welfare and public safety noted. County Sheriff Thomas Pike is hereby dispatched to investigate the property and report his findings. Sheriff Thomas Pike was a former soldier, a man known for his calm demeanor and his methodical approach to his duties. His personal logbook, a leather-bound volume filled with terse, factual entries, provides the first official account of the Sullivan house. The entry, for November 2nd, 1834, begins plainly. Attended the Sullivan property at 10 o'clock this morning, accompanied by Deputy Miller. Found the main gates locked and chained from the inside. A heavy padlock, rusted from the rain. We forced it with a pry bar. No tracks on the lane, but our own. The grounds are overgrown, the gardens choked with weeds. The corn in the fields is as Mills described. We found 2 cows deceased in the pasture. Another was down, but still breathing. The deputy was instructed to put the animal out of its misery. The air is thick with a strange, sweetish odor. The sheriff's log continues, detailing his approach to the house itself. The front doors were barred from the inside with a heavy oak beam. All ground floor windows were shuttered and locked from within. We gained entry by forcing a rear kitchen window. The house is cold and silent. A thick layer of dust covers every surface. In the kitchen, a half-eaten meal sits on the table. Bread has gone to mold. A pitcher of milk has soured. It appears the occupants left in a great hurry. In the middle of their supper, we proceeded to search the main floor. Pike's inventory is meticulous, almost obsessive in its detail, as if the sheer normalcy of the objects he found was itself a source of suspicion. He lists the furniture, the paintings on the walls, the books on the shelves. In Mr. Sullivan's study, he found a ledger detailing the estate's finances, all in perfect order. A small lockbox on the desk contained over $200 in cash, untouched. There was no sign of robbery. There was no sign of a struggle. The family's clothes were still in their wardrobes, their boots by the door. It was a portrait of a life abruptly paused. Mrs. Sullivan's sewing basket sat by the hearth, a needle still threaded through a piece of linen. The deputy, Miller, was a younger man, and a partially recovered letter he wrote to his brother a week later provides a more personal perspective. The page is water-stained and torn, but the visible portion reads, "The stillness of that house was unnatural. It was not an empty quiet, but a watchful one. Every stair tread groaned under my weight. The dust motes hung in the air like a fog. The sheriff was all business, but I saw the way he kept his hand near his pistol. In the upstairs rooms, we found the beds made. 3 rooms in total. 1 for the parents. The other 2 were smaller, with simple cots. But they were bare. No toys, no books, no sign that a child had ever lived in them. It felt more like a barracks than a family home." The sheriff made his notes and said nothing. The official log entry from Sheriff Pike confirms this observation, though in his typical, unadorned prose. Upstairs bedroom searched. Master bedroom contains clothing and effects for one male, one female. Two smaller rooms contain simple beds. No personal effects. All rooms are orderly. The entry continues to describe the attic, which was found to be empty, save for old furniture covered in white cloths. The house was a shell, perfectly preserved and utterly lifeless. The evidence suggested the Sullivans had simply walked out of their home in the middle of an autumn evening, leaving everything they owned behind. Sheriff Pike's log entry for November 2nd covers 2 full pages. He documents every room, every observation, with methodical precision. His conclusion begins at the top of the 3rd page. I have found no evidence of foul play. There is no sign of violence, theft, or forced entry other than our own. The state of the property suggests an unplanned and hasty departure. I have sealed the kitchen window we used for entry and have secured the main doors of the house with a new lock, for which I hold the only key. The property is now secured pending further investigation into the whereabouts of the Sullivan family. His report appears complete, a tidy summary of an inexplicable, but not necessarily sinister, event. But the logbook itself tells a different story. The entry for November 2nd does not end there. A faint indentation on the page and a small, ragged tear at the bottom corner indicate that a final paragraph was written and then physically torn away. The page is brittle, and only a few words from the final, excised sentence remain legible next to the binding. The fragment of the last sentence reads, "The basement door, however, is bolted from the outside. Sheriff Pike's official report was filed with the county clerk on the morning of November 3, 1834. It was a model of bureaucratic brevity, concluding with a recommendation that the Sullivan estate be declared derelict and its assets managed by the county until such time as Mr. Sullivan or a legal heir could be located." The document was clean, concise, and calming. It asserted that the family had, for reasons unknown, departed of their own free will. The matter, for all official purposes, was closed. For a time, the county accepted this version of events. The strangeness of the Sullivan family had always set them apart, and a sudden, silent departure seemed in keeping with their secretive nature. The story became a local curiosity, a tale told over hearths as the first snows of winter began to fall. But the official record, pristine and final, could not contain the unease that festered underneath. The house still stood on the hill, silent and dark, a monument to an unanswered question. The first cracks in the official narrative appeared not in documents, but in whispers. Deputy Miller, a young man not yet hardened to the grim realities of his profession, was seen frequently at the town tavern. A letter from the tavern owner, Mr. Abernathy, to his brother in Staunton, dated November 20th, provides a second-hand account. The sheriff's deputy has been taking his supper here most nights, a quiet lad, but the Sullivan business has left a mark on him. He drinks his whiskey and stares into the fire. He will not speak of what he saw in that house, but his silence is louder than any tale. Last night, one of the loggers asked him if it was true they found the devil's work up there. The boy just shook his head, white as a sheet, and said, "Worse." He would say no more. These small seeds of doubt found fertile ground in the community. Eleanor Vance, in a letter to her sister dated November 28th, captures the shifting tone. The talk in town is soured. At first, people imagined Mr. Sullivan had fled his debts, or that his wife had run off with another man. Now, the stories are darker. They speak of strange shipments Mr. Sullivan used to receive, crates marked with foreign symbols that came by night. They say the high walls of his estate were not to keep intruders out, but to keep his family in. The abandoned fields, the starving cattle. People see it now as a sign of a curse, a place forsaken by God. John forbids me from taking the North Road anymore. He says the air near that place feels heavy and unwell. Jedediah Mills, the Sullivans' neighbor, provided no fodder for such superstitious tales. His diary entries from this period remain stubbornly practical, yet they contribute their own layer of dread. An entry from December 1st reads, "The snow does not lie right on the Sullivan property. On my land, it is a clean, white sheet. Over there, it seems to melt in strange patches, especially near the foundation of the house. Not from heat, for no smoke comes from the chimneys. It turns to a gray slush. The smell I noted before has not gone away. The cold has sharpened it. It is a foulness that clings to the back of the throat, the smell of damp earth and old meat. I have instructed my sons to keep to the southern pastures. We will not go near that wall." Sheriff Pike, for his part, remained a figure of stoic authority. He publicly decried the spreading rumors as the fearful gossip of idle minds. His logbook contains a frustrated entry on December 5th. "Addressed the magistrate today on the matter of the Sullivan estate. The town is stirring itself into a pointless panic. Miller's loose tongue is to blame. Have confined him to clerical duties. The facts of the case are clear. A family has left, that is all." Yet, the entry feels defensive, the words of a man trying to convince himself as much as the record. The pressure on Magistrate Philip Davies was growing. He was a man of politics, sensitive to the mood of his constituents. An official letter from his office, addressed to Sheriff Pike and dated December 10th, reflects this. The tone is formal but firm. "Sheriff, the escalating public anxiety regarding the Sullivan property requires your attention. While I have full faith in your initial report, the persistence of certain unsettling tales is becoming a threat to public order. I must insist you take measures to definitively quell these rumors. A second, more public inspection may be in order, simply to demonstrate that there is nothing to fear." There is no record of Sheriff Pike's written response. However, we can infer its contents from a subsequent, far more urgent letter from Magistrate Davies, dated December 12th. This letter was found among Davies's private papers, and it seems it was never sent. The ink is splattered in places, the handwriting rushed. "Thomas, your refusal is unacceptable. This is no longer about idle gossip. Jedediah Mills was in my office this morning. He was mending a fence along the Sullivan property line when his dog began to dig at the base of the wall. It unearthed a small bundle of rags. Inside the rags, Thomas, was a child's leather shoe. It was worn through at the toe, and it was caked in what looked like dried blood. This is no longer a matter of an abandoned house. It is now a matter of a missing child, perhaps more than one. Your report mentioned no children. It mentioned bare rooms. Explain this." The final piece of this puzzle comes from a most unexpected source. A young clerk in the magistrate's office, tasked with burning superfluous drafts and old notices, apparently saved one such document from the fire. Perhaps its contents disturbed him, or perhaps he simply used it for scrap paper. It is a single sheet, torn and creased, covered in Thomas Pike's distinctive, severe handwriting. It is clearly a preliminary draft of his report from the initial investigation on November 2nd. Much of the text is the same as the final official version, detailing the forced gate, the dust-covered rooms, the half-eaten meal. But then, at the bottom of the page, is a paragraph that is violently crossed out with thick, black strokes of ink. Holding the fragile paper up to the light, the cancelled words can still be deciphered. The passage reads, "We completed our search of the ground floor and the upstairs rooms. All was in order, as noted. Before departing, I instructed Deputy Miller to check the integrity of the cellar door, located in the rear pantry. He found it to be made of heavy oak, reinforced with iron straps. It was secured from the outside by a large, newly forged iron bolt. This was the only lock in the entire house that showed no signs of rust or age. A profound and unpleasant odor emanated from the cracks around the doorframe. Miller, who is not a fanciful man, claimed he could hear a faint sound from within. He described it as a soft, rhythmic scratching like a trapped animal. I instructed him that we had no warrant to force interior doors and that the sound was likely rats. However, the scratching did not cease until our footsteps receded. The discovery of the child's shoe and the subsequent revelation of Sheriff Pike's original, uncensored notes left Magistrate Davies with no alternative. Publicly, he maintained a front of procedural diligence. He issued a formal order, citing new evidence and the need to conduct a thorough inventory for the county's tax rolls. Privately, his correspondence reveals a man grappling with a rapidly escalating sense of dread. A hastily written letter to his brother, a lawyer in Richmond, dated December 14, 1834, speaks of his fears. The Sullivan affair has taken a dark turn. Pike is a good man, a steady hand, but he has been evasive. His report was a lie of omission. I fear he saw something in that house that he could not face, and in trying to protect this community from a truth he deemed too terrible, he has only delayed the reckoning. Tomorrow, I will accompany him and his deputy back to that cursed place. We are taking axes and pry bars. I pray to God we are only there to inventory furniture. Sheriff Pike's logbook entry for December 15th is a stark contrast to the magistrate's anxious prose. It is written with a soldier's economy of language, every word a stone laid in a wall. Second inspection of the Sullivan estate. Arrived 0900 hours, accompanied by Magistrate Davies and Deputy Miller. Weather is cold, clear, light snow on the ground. Entered the house using the key from the previous inspection. The interior is unchanged. The dust is thicker. The silence is absolute. The party moved through the house with a grim purpose. They did not linger on the main floor or in the sterile upstairs bedrooms. Their destination was the pantry at the rear of the kitchen. A fragment of a sworn deposition given by Deputy Miller months later, before it was seized and classified by state officials, survives. The paper is yellowed and brittle, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. Miller's testimony is halting, relayed through a county clerk who transcribed his spoken words. The magistrate held the lantern. The sheriff stood before the cellar door. It was just as I remembered. Heavy, dark wood, black iron straps. The bolt was thick as a man's wrist, and it shone in the lamplight, not a speck of rust on it. The smell was worse than before. A cellar smell, yes, of damp stone and earth. But there was something else beneath it, something sickly sweet. The magistrate, he held a handkerchief to his face. The sheriff, he just stood there, staring at the bolt. He did not want to open it. I saw it in his eyes. He knew what was behind that door. Sheriff Pike's own account in his logbook is, as always, devoid of emotion. The cellar door was secured as previously noted. Magistrate Davies ordered it opened. The bolt was stiff, required the use of a pry bar. Once the bolt was drawn, the door did not open. It was held fast from within. We used the axes to breach it. It is here that the official records begin to fracture. Pike's logbook entry for the day ends abruptly after that sentence. The rest of the page is blank. The next several pages have been cleanly cut from the book with a sharp blade. Our understanding of what happened next must be pieced together from other, more damaged sources. The first is a letter, or rather a fragment of one, from Magistrate Davies. It is undated and unsigned, and it is unclear to whom it was addressed, though the intimate, horrified tone suggests a close confidant. The fragment was apparently used to light a fire, and its edges are scorched black, the words disappearing into ash. It reads, "The wood splintered and gave way, the air that rushed out of that darkness. It was not air. It was a stench so foul, so profound, that Miller retched on the floor. It was the smell of a tomb, of unwashed bodies and human waste, and something else. A coppery, metallic tang that coated the tongue." Pike held the lantern high, and we looked down a steep, narrow flight of stone steps into absolute blackness. There was no sound. For a moment, I thought perhaps we were wrong, that it was just a root cellar gone bad, filled with spoiled provisions. Then the sheriff took the first step down. The most complete and disturbing account comes from a surprising source. The town physician, a Dr. Alistair Finch, was summoned to the estate late in the afternoon of December 15th. He was a man of science, a skeptic by trade, who viewed the world through a lens of rational observation. His private journal, a meticulously kept record of his professional life, was thought to have been destroyed. However, a single, loose sheaf of papers, tucked inside a medical textbook, was discovered decades later. The entry is titled simply, "Sullivan Estate." Dr. Finch begins with his arrival. Sheriff Pike sent his deputy for me near dusk. The boy, Miller, was ashen-faced and could not meet my eye. He said only that there had been an incident and that my presence was required. He would not elaborate. The ride to the estate was silent and swift. When we arrived, the house was dark, save for a single lantern glowing in a downstairs window. I was met at the door by Magistrate Davies. His face was a mask of shock. His hands trembled so violently he could barely hold his lantern steady. He led me to a small pantry off the kitchen. The door to the cellar had been hacked to pieces. The air. I have been a physician for 20 years. I have stood in charnel houses and attended to the victims of cholera. I am not unfamiliar with the odors of sickness and death, but the smell that rose from that cellar was unlike anything I have ever encountered. It was a miasma of profound and protracted misery. The doctor's clinical detachment provides a chilling clarity to the scene. Pike was waiting for us at the bottom of the steps. He held a lantern in one hand and his service pistol in the other. The cellar was small, perhaps 20 feet square, with a low, vaulted ceiling of rough-hewn stone. The floor was packed earth, damp and cold. There was no furniture, no storage crates, no sign of provisions. The room was empty, save for what was on the walls. Bolted into the stone at regular intervals were iron rings. From these rings hung chains, and at the end of the chains were children. The doctor's handwriting, usually so precise, becomes slightly unsteady here. There were 47 of them, I counted. They ranged in age from what I could only guess was 4 or 5 years to early adolescence. They were emaciated, their limbs like twigs, their skin a pale, almost translucent gray, stretched tight over their bones. They were covered in sores and filth. Many were too weak to stand, and they lay on the cold earth floor, their small chests barely rising and falling. Others stood, their eyes wide and vacant in the lantern light, pupils dilated to black pools. They did not speak. They did not cry. They did not react to our presence at all. They simply watched us, their heads turning in perfect, silent unison to follow the light of the lantern. It was the silence that was the most unnatural. A room full of suffering children should be a place of noise. This was a crypt. Dr. Finch's medical assessment follows. It is a litany of horrors, recorded with cold precision. I examined several of the subjects. All exhibited signs of extreme malnutrition and dehydration. Their muscles were severely atrophied. Their teeth were rotted. Many had lost their hair in patches. I noted extensive bruising and ligature marks on their wrists and ankles from the iron manacles. But most disturbing were their eyes. There was no light in them, no recognition. It was as if the person within had long since departed, leaving only the shell behind. When I tried to speak to one, a young girl of perhaps 7 years, she did not respond. She only stared at my mouth as it moved, as if trying to remember what sound was. The entry continues, detailing the grim task of removing the children from the cellar. The magistrate was in a state of near collapse. The sheriff was a pillar of stone, his face unreadable. He and Miller began the work of breaking the chains. They used a sledgehammer and a cold chisel. The sound of the hammer striking the iron echoed terribly in that small, silent space. With each shattering blow, the children did not flinch. They did not react at all. One by one, we carried them up the stairs and laid them on blankets in the kitchen. They were as light as bundles of sticks, 47 souls, and not one of them made a sound. The final paragraph of Dr. Finch's account is a testament to his own crumbling composure. The careful, scientific prose gives way to something more raw, more human. As we brought the last child up from that damnable hole, I noticed something I had missed in the initial shock. On the far wall of the cellar, carved into the stone, were hundreds upon hundreds of small, vertical lines, scratched into the rock with a nail or a sharp stone. They were tally marks, grouped in sets of 5. There were too many to count in the flickering light, but they covered the wall from floor to ceiling. What were they counting? The days, the meals? The ones who had been taken? I do not know, and I do not wish to know. I have seen the face of utter despair. It is silent, and it is legion. The discovery in the Sullivan cellar did not remain a county secret for long. Magistrate Davies, shaken from his political caution by the sheer enormity of the horror, sent an urgent dispatch to the state capitol in Richmond before the sun had risen on December 16th. His message, preserved in the state archives, is a frantic plea for assistance. An incident of unparalleled depravity has occurred at the Sullivan estate. Request immediate and discreet assistance from the state militia and the Attorney General's office. The situation is beyond the capacity of local resources. Utmost secrecy is required to prevent mass panic. God help us. The state's response was swift and decisive. Within 48 hours, Albemarle County was quietly cordoned off. Men who were not local, dressed in plain clothes but carrying the unmistakable authority of government agents, arrived in unmarked carriages. They did not answer questions. They established a perimeter around the Sullivan estate, turning away curious townsfolk with firm, non-negotiable orders. A contingent of state militia, under the command of a Captain Wallace, requisitioned the town hall, turning it into a temporary command post. The official explanation given to the public was that a severe outbreak of typhoid had been discovered on the property, and a quarantine was necessary to protect the county. This quarantine was the first act in a systematic and thorough erasure of the event. All records pertaining to the Sullivan family were confiscated from the county clerk's office. Sheriff Pike's logbook, Silas Croft's ledgers, Magistrate Davies' correspondence, all were taken. The men from Richmond were not collecting evidence for a trial. They were burying a history. A partial record of this process exists in the form of a burned journal, believed to belong to one of Magistrate Davies' clerks. The journal was found years later, stuffed into the wall of a building undergoing renovation. Many pages are unreadable, blackened by fire and water damage, but the legible entries paint a chilling picture of the official cover-up. An entry dated December 18th reads, "Captain Wallace's men have taken everything. They went through the courthouse like a storm, taking ledgers and letters, even old tax receipts." The magistrate protested, but Wallace presented him with an order signed by the governor himself. "We have been instructed to speak to no one about what we know. The penalty for doing so was not stated, but it was understood. The children are gone. They were taken away in covered wagons in the middle of the night. No one knows where." Dr. Finch's medical notes were among the first documents to be seized. Before they were taken, however, it appears he made a desperate attempt to preserve his findings. A colleague of his from a neighboring county, a Dr. Abram Pettigrew, received a letter from Finch, dated December 19th. The letter is guarded, written in a kind of code the two physicians had developed for discussing sensitive cases. It speaks of a plague of the spirit that has afflicted a large and silent family. Finch writes, "The malady presents as a total cessation of the will. The subjects are listless, unresponsive to external stimuli. Their physical forms are wasted, but it is the vacancy of the soul that is the most pronounced symptom. We have attempted nourishment, but they seem to have forgotten how to eat. We have tried to coax speech, but their mouths have forgotten the shape of words. They are bodies without inhabitants. I fear there is no cure for what has been done to them, for the disease is not in the flesh, but in the memory." The letter ends with a postscript that steps outside their code. "Abram, they are taking my records. I am writing this in haste. If you do not hear from me again, know that what happened here was not a disease. It was a harvest." The principal witnesses were silenced with brutal efficiency. Deputy Miller, who had been vocal in his horror, was the first to disappear. His last known communication is the torn fragment of his deposition. According to the tavern owner, Mr. Abernathy, Miller was escorted from his boarding room late one night by two of Captain Wallace's men. He was never seen in Albemarle County again. A notice in the Richmond newspaper a month later reported that a man matching his description had been found dead in an alley, the victim of an apparent robbery. Magistrate Philip Davies was subjected to a more subtle form of removal. A formal letter from the governor's office, dated December 22nd, informed him that he was being reassigned to a remote administrative post in the Western Territories, effective immediately. The reason given was his admirable handling of a difficult public health crisis. It was an exile disguised as a promotion. His burned journal's final legible entry reads, "They have silenced us all. They are not interested in justice for those children. They are interested in forgetting them. They say it is for the good of the Commonwealth, to prevent a stain upon its reputation. But a stain is not removed by painting over it. It is still there, beneath the surface, festering. I have seen the cellar. I will carry the memory of that silence to my grave." Sheriff Thomas Pike, a man of military discipline and ingrained obedience, proved more compliant. He remained in his post, a silent and hollowed-out figure of authority. His official logbook, when it was eventually returned to the county, was a shadow of its former self. The pages detailing the Sullivan investigation were gone, replaced by a single, newly written entry. The penmanship is Pike's, but the words are clinical and alien, clearly dictated to him. The entry, dated December 16th, states that the Sullivan house was found to be empty, and that rumors of a more sinister discovery were the product of local hysteria brought on by the typhoid scare. It is a perfect, seamless fiction. The only sign of the man who wrote the original, truthful account is a small, dark smudge near the signature, a single drop of ink that has bled into the paper like a tear. The Sullivan name itself was the final target of the erasure. Land deeds were altered, census records were amended. Within a generation, it was as if the family had never existed. The estate was declared property of the state and left to fall into ruin, the high stone walls a silent warning to the curious. The official story held. The Sullivans were a reclusive family who had succumbed to a virulent fever and were buried in unmarked graves to prevent the spread of the contagion. But history, once written, cannot be entirely unwritten. Fragments remain, defying the fire and the censors. The most unsettling of these is a single, charred page, believed to be the missing portion of Deputy Miller's sworn deposition. It was found with the magistrate's clerk's journal, suggesting the two men may have attempted to preserve a record together. The page is badly damaged, but its contents are a horrifying addendum to Dr. Finch's clinical account. The deposition describes the moment after the last child had been carried from the cellar. It reads, "The sheriff sent me back down for the blankets. He was with the doctor, and the magistrate was outside being sick. I went down the steps alone. The lanterns cast shadows on the walls. It was then I saw the marks, the scratches in the stone Dr. Finch had noted. But I looked closer. They were not just tally marks. Among them were words, or what looked like words, crudely gouged into the rock. The letters were misshapen, childish. It was hard to read. One phrase was repeated over and over. It said, "He comes from the dirt." In another place, near the floor, was a small, crude drawing. It was a stick figure of a man, but he had no face. In the place where his face should have been, there was only a spiral, a coil turning inward. Below the drawing was another word, hunger. The deposition continues, the clerk's transcription capturing Miller's rising panic. As I was looking at the drawing, my lantern light fell upon a section of the dirt floor I had not noticed before. In the far corner, the earth was not packed down. It was loose, as if it had been recently turned. I saw the edge of something sticking out of the soil. It was a piece of wood, smooth and dark. I knelt down and brushed the dirt away. It was the top of a small wooden box, about the size of a child's coffin. It was not buried deep. I worked my fingers under the lid and pried it open. Inside there was nothing. The box was empty, but the bottom of it was lined with dozens of small, white objects. I picked one up. It was a tooth, a child's milk tooth. The box was filled with them. There must have been hundreds, and as I held it in my hand, I heard a sound from the dirt beneath the empty box. It was a soft, wet, chewing sound, and the smell, that sour, awful smell from the fields. It was coming from the ground, right in front of me. The state-sanctioned quarantine of the Sullivan estate lasted for 3 months, a period of enforced silence that settled over Albemarle County like a winter shroud. By the spring of 1835, The men from Richmond had departed as quietly as they had arrived. The militia barracks at the town hall were emptied, the confiscated records were gone, and the official narrative of a tragic but contained typhoid outbreak was cemented in the public consciousness. The Sullivan affair was over, but for the men who had stood in the cellar, the silence was not an absence of noise, but a presence. It was the silence of the 47 children, a profound and bottomless quiet that had followed them out of that dark place. Sheriff Thomas Pike became a ghost in his own office, a man performing his duties by rote memory. A letter from his sister, who visited him in the summer of 1835, expresses deep concern for his health. Thomas is much changed. He has lost a great deal of weight, and his eyes have a haunted, distant look. He barely speaks, and when he does, his voice is a dry whisper. He spends his evenings staring into the fire, his hands clenched. He refuses to speak of his work, but the cook at his boarding house says he does not sleep. She hears him pacing his room at all hours of the night, and sometimes, she says, she hears him speaking to himself in a low, urgent tone, repeating the same words over and over. She cannot make them out, but she says it sounds like he is counting. Dr. Alistair Finch retreated into his work, his scientific curiosity replaced by a grim, almost frantic obsession. He began a private study, ostensibly on the effects of malnutrition on childhood development. He traveled to orphanages and poorhouses across Virginia, seeking out children who had suffered extreme neglect. His notes from this period, which he kept hidden from his family, are filled with frantic comparisons and desperate calculations. He measures the circumference of skulls, the length of limbs, the dilation of pupils. On every page, in the margins, he scrawls the same number, 47. An entry from his private journal, dated October 1835, reveals the true nature of his research. None of them are the same. I have examined over 100 cases of severe privation, and while the physical symptoms are often similar, the spiritual affliction is entirely absent. These children, though starved and beaten, still possess a spark. They cry, they rage, they hope. They are not the empty vessels I saw in that cellar. What was done to them was more than simple starvation. It was a methodical emptying, a hollowing out. The body was merely the cage, left behind after the bird had been taken. But what took it, and where did it go? The most direct and perhaps most tragic consequence of the erasure was the fate of the children themselves. After being taken from the estate in the dead of night, they vanished from history. The official story was that they were transported to a special state-run sanatorium in the mountains, a place equipped to handle the most severe cases of the typhoid outbreak. No such sanatorium existed. There are no state records of their admission, no medical charts, no burial plots. 47 children were taken into the custody of the state of Virginia, and 47 children ceased to be. One single, tenuous thread of their story survives. It comes from a deathbed confession of a former militiaman, a man named Corporal Benjamin Ives, who spoke to a parish priest in 1878, more than 40 years after the event. The priest, troubled by what he heard, wrote down an account of the confession, which was found among his personal papers after his own death. The account is harrowing. Ives claimed to have been one of the soldiers under Captain Wallace's command. He described the children as dolls made of skin and bone. His testimony continues. We were told they had a brain fever, that they were dangerous. We put them in 3 covered wagons. They did not resist. They did not even seem to know we were there. We drove for 2 days, north into the mountains, to a place where the road ran out. There was an old, abandoned iron mine there. The entrance was a black hole in the side of the hill. Captain Wallace had his orders, direct from Richmond. He said the plague was too virulent, that it could not be allowed to spread. He said this was a mercy. The priest's transcription of Ives's confession becomes almost unreadable at this point, the handwriting shaky and marred by ink blots. He said they led the children into the mine. They did not need to force them. The children walked into the darkness as if they were going home. They made no sound, not a single one. Then Wallace's men sealed the entrance. They used timber and rock and packed earth, and when they were done, You would never know a mine had been there at all. I've said that as they were rolling the last boulder into place, he heard a sound from within the mountain. It was not a cry for help. He said it was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like dozens of tiny hammers on stone. It went on for a minute, and then it stopped. That was all. Back in Albemarle County, the Sullivan estate rotted. The fields grew wild, the stone walls crumbled, and the house itself began to sag under the weight of neglect and memory. The typhoid story held for a time, but local folklore has a longer memory than official records. People began to speak of the place in hushed tones again. They called it the Hollow House. Travelers on the North Road reported seeing strange lights in the windows, though the house had no glass left in its frames. Farmers claimed their livestock would not graze near the property line, that the animals would grow skittish and wild-eyed if forced too close to the wall. Jedediah Mills, whose farm bordered the estate, recorded several strange occurrences in his diary. An entry from the winter of 1836 reads, "A heavy snow fell last night, the deepest of the year. This morning I saw tracks leading from the Sullivan Woods to the edge of my property. They were small tracks, like those of a barefoot child, dozens of them. They came right up to my fence line, and then they stopped, as if they could come no further. There were no tracks leading back into the woods. They simply ended at the fence. It is as if they rose up out of the frozen ground and then sank back into it." A more disturbing account comes from a letter written by Eleanor Vance in the spring of 1837. Her tone is no longer one of neighborly concern, but of genuine fear. "My youngest son, Samuel, has been having nightmares. He wakes up screaming. He says a pale boy with dark eyes stands at the foot of his bed and watches him sleep. The boy doesn't speak, Samuel says, but he is hungry. He points toward the window, in the direction of the old Sullivan place. John has nailed his window shut. We have begun to look for land in the next county. I cannot bear to raise my children in the shadow of that house." The final piece of this chapter comes from Sheriff Pike. In 1840, 6 years after the discovery, he retired from his post. He left Albemarle County and moved to a small, isolated cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He lived there as a recluse for the remainder of his life. After his death in 1852, his meager possessions were collected by his nephew. Among them was his old service pistol and a small, leather-bound book. It was not his official logbook, but a private journal. Most of it is filled with mundane observations about the weather and hunting, but the very last page contains a single, undated entry. The handwriting is crabbed and weak, the writing of a very old or very sick man. The entry reads, "It was never about the children. They were just the vessels, the food." Elias Sullivan did not flee. He was the last meal. He thought he could control the hunger, that he could bargain with it. He brought it offerings, kept it fed, and in return it gave him, what? Knowledge? Wealth? He built the walls high to keep his secret in, but the hunger was not in the cellar. It was in the ground. It was always in the ground. When we opened that door, we did not let the children out. We let the hunger in. It has no face. It only has a need. I hear it sometimes, in the wind that rattles the door, a soft, wet, chewing sound, and the counting. It never stops the counting. Beneath this entry, scrawled with a trembling hand, is a crude drawing. It is a spiral, a coil turning endlessly inward upon itself. With the official silencing of the Sullivan affair, the estate itself became a repository for the county's fear. The narrative of typhoid, while publicly accepted, did not sit well in the private minds of those who lived within sight of its crumbling stone walls. The house was not merely abandoned. It was shunned. For years, no one approached it. The lane leading to the gates became choked with weeds and brambles until it was nearly impassable. The house itself surrendered to the elements, its roof sagging, its windows gaping like empty sockets. It was a wound on the landscape, left to fester. In 1859, the state of Virginia, in an effort to divest itself of derelict properties, sold the land at auction for a pittance. The buyer was a speculator from Baltimore who never visited the property and sold it 2 years later, sight unseen, to a man named Josiah Foster. Foster was a New Englander, a veteran of industry from Massachusetts, who sought to leave the crowded cities of the North and try his hand at the life of a Virginian gentleman farmer. He arrived in the spring of 1862 with his wife Abigail and their 2 young children, a boy named Caleb and a girl named Sarah. The Foster family's story is preserved in a collection of letters Abigail wrote to her sister in Boston. They provide a detailed and ultimately tragic account of the attempt to reclaim the Sullivan land. Her early letters are filled with the resolute optimism of a pioneer. A letter from May 1862 reads, "The land is beautiful, Eleanor, though terribly neglected. The locals are a strange, superstitious lot. They speak of our new home with a kind of pitying dread, referencing an old sickness that they say soured the soil. Josiah pays them no mind. He is a man of logic and hard work, and he sees only potential here. The old stone house is a ruin, likely beyond repair. We are living in the barn for now, which Josiah has made quite comfortable. He plans to dismantle the main house and use the stone to build a new, more modest cottage for us on higher ground." Josiah Foster began his work with vigor. He hired local laborers to help clear the fields and tear down the derelict house. Abigail's letters from this period chronicle the first signs of difficulty. From a letter dated June 1862, "The work on the old house is proving more difficult than Josiah anticipated. The foundation is unusually deep, the stones set with a skill that seems out of place for such a plain building. The men Josiah hired are sullen and fearful. 2 of them quit yesterday, claiming the air in the cellar gave them headaches and clouded their thoughts. Josiah had to go down himself to fetch the tools they left behind. When he came back up, he was pale and said the air was foul, but nothing more. He has ordered the cellar to be filled in with rubble and sealed before we build anew." A week later, another letter shows the first hint of personal disquiet. "A strange thing happened today. Our Sarah, who is only 6, was playing near the pile of stones taken from the old foundation. I saw her picking something up and putting it in her apron pocket. When I asked her what she had found, she showed me. It was a small, white stone, shaped like a tiny peg. Then she showed me another, and another. Eleanor, they were teeth. Small, perfect milk teeth. There were dozens of them mixed in with the mortar and the dirt of the foundation. When I asked Sarah to give them to me, she refused. She clutched them in her little fist and said, 'They're counting them.' I could not get another word out of her about who 'they' were." By the autumn of 1862, the Fosters' optimism had begun to curdle into a grim struggle. The war that was tearing the nation apart seemed a distant concern compared to the private war they were waging with their own land. Josiah had managed to clear and plant a field of winter wheat, but the crop was failing. Abigail writes in October, "The wheat has come in thin and pale, the stalks like straw and the heads empty of grain. Josiah cannot understand it. The soil is rich and dark, yet it yields nothing of substance." Jedediah Mills's grandson, who now owns the neighboring farm, told Josiah that nothing has grown right on this land since the Sullivans' time. He says the ground takes more than it gives. He is a simple man, but his words have a weight to them that I cannot dismiss. "We have been forced to buy feed for our livestock, a great and unexpected expense." The psychological toll on the family, particularly the children, becomes the dominant theme of Abigail's letters through the winter. A passage from December 1862 is particularly disturbing. Caleb has become withdrawn. He spends hours staring out at the ruined foundation of the old house. He no longer plays with his sister. Yesterday, I found him in the barn, scratching patterns into a wooden beam with a nail. He had drawn a spiral, a tight, coiling line that turned in on itself. When I asked him what it was, he said, "It's the shape of the hole." He would not explain further. Both children are so quiet now. The laughter has gone out of our home. They move through their days like little ghosts, their eyes large and dark. They do not complain of being hungry, yet they grow thinner by the day. The final letter from Abigail Foster is dated February 1863. It is short, and the handwriting is jagged and desperate. Eleanor, we are leaving. We cannot stay another night. Last night, I awoke to a sound, a soft, rhythmic scratching coming from beneath the floorboards of the barn. Josiah heard it too. He took his rifle and a lantern and went outside. He was gone for a long time. When he came back, his face was the color of ash. He would not tell me what he saw. He only said, "Didis, they are in the ground, they are counting." He has been packing the wagon since sunrise. We are abandoning everything. The land, the tools, the livestock. We are taking only the children. I fear we may be too late for them. Sarah was talking in her sleep last night. She was not using her own voice. It was a whisper, a dry and rustling sound, and she was speaking numbers. Just numbers, over and over again. The Foster family departed Albemarle County as silently as the Sullivans had. The land was once again left to itself. For another decade, it remained untouched, its reputation now sealed by the Fosters' failure. The half-finished cottage was reclaimed by weeds, and the filled-in cellar of the old house began to sink, forming a shallow, stagnant depression in the earth. The next official record concerning the property comes from 1872. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, planning a new spur line to connect Charlottesville with the western part of the state, dispatched a survey team to plot a course through the area. The chief surveyor, a man named Orville Peck, was a man of science and engineering, with no patience for local superstition. His field notes, preserved in the railway's archives, begin with professional detachment. An entry from September 1872 reads, "Commence survey of the old Sullivan parcel. The land is overgrown, but appears suitable for grading. Local guides are proving difficult, refusing to camp on the property and citing absurd local legends of a haunting. Their fear is contagious. My men are on edge. I have had to double their whiskey ration." A few days later, Peck's notes begin to record anomalies. Encountered significant magnetic deviation in the vicinity of the old house foundation. Compass needles spin erratically within a 100-foot radius of the site. I suspect a large, unrecorded iron deposit, though the geology of this region makes that unlikely. The men refuse to work in the area after dusk, claiming to hear whispering on the wind. I have heard nothing but the wind itself. Peck's final entry on the Sullivan parcel is dated October 1872. His professional tone has cracked, replaced by one of frustrated confusion. A boarding survey of this route, the problems are insurmountable. It is not merely the magnetic deviation. The ground itself is wrong. Core samples taken near the foundation show a soil composition I cannot identify. It is black and loamy, but it is sterile. Nothing grows. More disturbingly, the ground temperature is a consistent 10 degrees colder than the surrounding land, even in direct sunlight. 2 of my men have fallen ill with a low fever and a persistent lethargy. They complain of nightmares. Yesterday, my transit man, a steady fellow named Harris, swore he saw a child watching them from the woods, a pale child with no eyes. He has since deserted his post. I cannot complete my work with a crew on the verge of mutiny. I am officially recommending we reroute the spur line 5 miles to the south, despite the additional cost of 3 trestle bridges. This land is unsuitable for development. In my professional opinion, it should be struck from all maps and forgotten. The railway was rerouted. The land was forgotten once more. The story of the Sullivans and the Fosters faded from living memory into the realm of folklore. By the early 1900s, it had become a ghost story told to frighten children, a tale of the Hollow House and the Silent 47. In 1908, a professor of American folklore from the University of Virginia, a man named Alistair Hayes, visited Albemarle County to collect local tales. His notes contain several interviews with elderly residents whose grandparents had been alive in 1834. Hayes's notes show how the facts had been twisted by time. One resident speaks of a family of 47 children who all died of a plague and were buried in the cellar. Another tells of a miser named Sullivan who chained his children up to guard his gold and was devoured by them. But amidst the superstition, certain details remain strangely consistent. The sudden silence of the house, the number 47, the feeling of a profound hunger, and the strange, rhythmic sounds that came from the earth. Professor Hayes was a diligent researcher. Not content with folklore, he attempted to find the original county records. His correspondence with the state archives in Richmond reveals his frustration. He writes, "I have been informed that all county records for Albemarle from the autumn of 1834 are classified by order of the governor's office. The reason given is the protection of state security, a ludicrous explanation for a set of 70-year-old tax documents. It is clear there has been a deliberate and systematic concealment of the historical event. The story is not a fiction. It is a memory that has been actively suppressed." Hayes spent a month trying to circumvent the state's blockade. His final entry on the subject is a note scrawled on the back of a page of local legends. It details a discovery he made not in the courthouse, but in a dusty annex of the county land grant office. He found an old surveyor's map drawn in 1789, long before the Sullivan family had acquired the land. The map detailed the original parcels granted to settlers after the Revolution. The parcel in question was clearly marked, but it was not labeled with a family name. It was designated with a simple, chilling title written in the cartographer's elegant script. The title was The Gleaning Patch, and in the margin, next to the plot of land where the house would one day be built, was a small, faded notation. The ink was faint, the paper crumbling, but Hayes was able to transcribe the words. The note read, "Caution. Ground is fallow. Bedrock is soft and porous. Do not dig deep. The locals say it has a bottomless appetite." Nearly 2 centuries have passed. The Sullivan estate is a scar on the landscape, a collapsed foundation choked by kudzu and shadow. The state of Virginia long ago relinquished its claim, and the land remains unclaimed, appearing on no tax roll. Locals refer to the place simply as the Quiet Lot. They do not tell stories of ghosts or hauntings. Their warnings are more practical. They say the ground is unstable, that it sinks in unnatural ways, and that anything left on the property overnight, a tool, a fallen branch, will be gone by morning, pulled down into the soft, black soil. In 2011, a geological survey team, contracted to map potential shale deposits, placed seismic sensors on the property. Their official report noted only anomalous subterranean resonance of indeterminate origin, but a note, scrawled in the margin of the field team's log, was leaked years later. It described the resonance as a faint, rhythmic, and persistent scratching sound, emanating from a depth their equipment could not precisely measure. The sound was not random. It was organized, methodical, like the tapping of a fingernail against stone, counting the seconds in the long, patient dark.